Let's start off with the kind of gross and work our way to the grossest and most puke-worthy jobs on this list. Number 10, groom of the stool. As we've seen before in history, Europe absolutely worshipped their monarchs and believed them to be chosen by God. And when you've got that divine right bestowed upon you by the man upstairs, you tend to get a bit, well, entitled. And what's more entitled than employing a groom of the stool for your royal behind? The lucky assistant's job was to fetch the royal toilet chair, clean the king's behind, and examine their nether regions daily for any health issues. Yep, you heard that right. But the surprising thing is that being the royal butt wiper was actually seen as being a pretty high-status job among European nobles. You got to live in the castle, eat good food, and dress pretty well. That meant a better quality of life than you'd get out in the streets. So back in the day, being a nearly literal butt kisser was less gross and more grand. Number 9, Sin Eater. It might sound like something out of a heavy metal album, but trust me, it's not a job most people lined up for back then. When someone passed away, it was a custom to place a loaf of bread and a cup of beer on their chest. That's where the Sin Eater comes in, taking its place as one of the grossest jobs in human history. People believe that this humble feast would soak up some of the sins of the dead and give them an easier time in the grave. The Sin Eater's job was to show up and chow down on the spiritually loaded meal, effectively taking on the sins and allowing the departed soul a clean entry into the afterlife. In theory, this was a pretty sweet gig. You got free food every day, which was a huge achievement in medieval Europe, but that food came off a dead body. And here's another catch. Sin Eaters were often shunned by society and remained outcast until the end of their days. This is because people believed their souls took on the sins of the dead. And the weirdest part is that this practice isn't even that ancient. The last known Sin Eater in Britain only passed away in 1906. Is this job more creepy than gross? What do you think? Number 8, Bone Grubber. Believe it or not, recycling isn't just a modern-day trend, it's been around for ages. And the Victorian era has to be where recycling took on the biggest boom, mostly due to the extreme shortage of food and money. Bone grubbers were people who made a living scavenging bones from all sorts of places like butchers, trash heaps, and even graveyards. They'd then scrape them down, clean them up, and sell these bones to manufacturers. These manufacturers would then use the bones to craft things like toothbrush handles and even teething rings for kids. Ugh. And if they couldn't sell them all off, they'd grind them up into fertilizer or boil them down to make soap. They truly made the most out of every bit, and the bone grubbers got a nice little paycheck for their scavenger hunt. It may have been a kind of gross job, but it was profitable. Number 7, Fuller. Okay, y'all, we're back to the really gross. You know that cozy wool sweater you love snuggling up in? Well, that process for making that in the olden times is pretty high on our ick factor. Before it arrives all soft and fluffy, it goes through quite the transformation. Wool starts off kind of coarse and can fray pretty easily. That's because the wool is coated in natural oils and grease from the sheep's skin. To get rid of that and make the wool nice and soft, there's a gross job called fulling. Back in ancient Rome, it was a job for slaves, and they would be tasked to collect up all the raw wool. They would then empty it in a big tub and pour in gallons of urine. Yeah, you heard that right, urine. Urine was the cheapest and most easily available alkaline solution that could break down the grease and oil. Now, here's where it gets really gross. The fuller had to step right into that tub and stomp around on the wool with their bare feet. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they had to go around collecting all the pee from public toilets and people's homes. I know everyone says urine is sterile, but it still smells. What if everyone had eaten asparagus the night before? Gross. Number 6, Battlefield Scavenger. After a big battle, you've got two choices. Either deal with it as a health hazard or as a treasure trove, or both. Soldiers usually got the first crack at looting the fallen, but soon enough, ordinary people employed as scavengers would join in, grabbing everything from gear to bones. But scavenging the dead wasn't only a gruesomely gross job, it was a dangerous duty as well. You had gangs lurking around, hungry wolves waiting for a snack, and not to mention the risk of coming across an unexploded shell just waiting to go off. As grim as it sounds, the job of scavenging was a grossly necessary evil. With all those corpses waiting to rot and fester, something had to be done. And believe it or not, the job was even made official after the Battle of Waterloo. The bones from the battlefield were scooped up and used as fertilizer and were estimated to be 1 million bushels worth. Just for reference, 1 bushel is about 8 gallons. Talk about ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Number 5, leech collectors. Back in the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe loved everything to do with leeches. From medicines to natural remedies, leeches, as gross as they are, were seen as the ultimate cure. The practice of bloodletting became extremely common, and doctors thought draining blood from your body could cure all sorts of ailments. And as we all know, leeches were the go-to tool for the job. But grosser than thought of using leeches is thinking about where all these leeches came from. Somebody had to be providing a constant supply, and for a long time, those somebodies were poor peasant women. They'd have to step in swampy waters and let slimy creatures latch onto their legs. Then they'd collect them up by the dozens. Sure, it doesn't sound too tough, but it was seriously risky business. Those suckers could drain a fair bit of blood and could leave someone with serious infections. Fast forward to today, and leeches are kind of making a comeback in medicine. Nowadays, they're used to help with certain surgeries by promoting better blood flow. And get this, they're grown in labs now, so nobody has to go wading into gross waters half naked anymore. Thank goodness for modern medicine, right? But this still gets a solid ew gross from me. Number 4, violin string makers. Before the 17th century, making strings for musical instruments was a pretty gross process. See, to create thicker strings for instruments like violins, musicians had to get creative. And by creative, I mean downright disgusting. The go-to method was to twist strands and strands of sheep guts together. String makers had to be super careful when butchering the sheep, making sure not to damage the stomach or lower intestines. Then came hours upon hours of trimming away all the fatty tissue, blood vessels, and muscle. Then the guts got a nice soak in a solution of wood ash to clean them up even more. Finally, after all that, the innards were dried out and twisted into bass strings. The smell was gross enough to apparently make you never want to see another violin ever again. Gut strings are still used by some violin professionals today, but thankfully most use synthetic or steel materials. Definitely less gross. Number 3, body collectors. Being a battlefield scavenger, at least you knew what you were getting into, right? But when the Black Death rolled into Europe in the 1340s, things took a seriously gross turn. Suddenly there was a shortage of people willing to deal with the corpses oozing with the Black Plague. Not only a gross job, but a potentially fatal one. That's when plague doctors began walking around with their iconic beaked masks. Usually people think those masks were some kind of medieval germ-fighting armor, but nope, they were just a fancy way to carry around flowers that would block out the smell of death. The body collectors employed the same techniques in order to make their job a little more tolerable. In cities like Florence, where the plague hit hard, body collecting became a booming business. But instead of being hailed as heroes, these collectors were quarantined away from society and lived in fields surrounded by the bodies they gathered. Number 2, gong farmer. While most farmers were out tending to crops or livestock in medieval Europe, there was a special kind of farmer dealing with a different kind of crop. With cities getting bigger and proper sewage systems still a distant dream, there was a serious poop problem. You had streets upon streets filled with sewage, spreading infections and diseases everywhere. But then came gong farmers to the rescue. They had the unfortunately gross job of collecting all that human waste. They jump into cesspits, scoop out the human waste, and then recycle it as fertilizer or use it in building materials. Bricks made of poo? Who knew? They were paid by the actual ton for their efforts, giving a new meaning to ton. This gross job actually made some decent money by selling the waste to farmers for fertilizer. From poop to profit. Unfortunately, many gong farmers made a tragic end, often suffocating on the job, being consumed by the noxious fumes while up to their necks in human waste. A truly gross way to go. And despite their irreplaceable role, gong farmers were treated as lower-class citizens. In fact, they were often shunned by society and had to live in their own little communities. That's an absurd way to repay the people who single-handedly solved the sewage crisis in Europe. Number 1, tanner. Hands down, this has to be the grossest job on this list and was not for the faint of heart. Tanners played a crucial role in history by preserving animal hides for clothing and goods. They worked in giant pits filled with lime where hides were soaked to soften up and get rid of all the hair and extra meaty bits. Then they had to scrape off all that gunk by hand. And let me tell you, accidental lime exposure was one of the worst things that could happen to you then. Without the proper medicines, lime exposure led to some nasty chemical burns. But after the initial soak, the hides got dunked into another pit filled with water and, here we go again, feces. Yes, more poop. Not only did they use animal manure, but they sometimes even used poop from public toilets to further clean and soften the hides. Can you just imagine that smell? And as if that wasn't gross enough, these tanning pits would ferment over time, making Victorian-era tanneries some of the grossest, smelliest, most vile workplaces ever made. The smell being so bad that many tanners would vomit while on the job, just adding another layer of gross to the actual stench. On top of all that, even at home, tanners never quite got the smell off their skin. I think I can actually smell it right now just thinking of it. Blech! So there's my list of the grossest jobs in human history. Got a grosser one? Let me know in the comments, and just be thankful, however much you hate your job right now, that at least you aren't a Victorian-era tanner. I'm just going to go pop in the shower now. I feel kind of gross. Thanks for watching. You know what to do. Like and subscribe if you don't want to be a tanner.